Okay, so yes, for those of you who are here this morning, this is going to be, you're going to hear this repeated, but
You should memorize this.
you should memorize it. So one of our demands, our first demand is that we demand that the UMass administration pick our side and declare UMass a sanctuary campus system encompassing all 5 campuses.
And
Our second demand is that UMass open its doors to refugees, to dedicating financial assistance, housing, comprehensive psychological support services, and legal support to those seeking asylum.
Hilarious. We demand that UMass Amherst commit to not complying with ICE under any circumstances, and that UMass Amherst support our efforts to make Amherst a sanctuary city and the campus a sanctuary campus.
And we demand that UMass establish an action plan for supporting Muslim students, faculty, and staff who are racially profiled in connection with the Muslim ban and at risk of deportation or losing their immigration status.
We demand that UMass protect and assist students, faculty, and staff from countries that are currently banned, and students, faculty, and staff from any countries that are added to that ban in the future.
So we demand that the UMass system declare itself a sanctuary system across all the 5 campuses, that UMass commit to not allocating any resources to assist ICE or any federal agency in identifying, locating, and deporting undocumented immigrants. And unless they do that, it's not really a sanctuary campus. Unless they say we're not going to, we're not going to use any of our resources to support ICE, it's not actually a sanctuary campus.
We demand that UMass commit to continued support for documented students, regardless of whether DACA is overturned. It seems DACA isn't being overturned, but nonetheless, DACA, young people in the United States who are DACA are currently being arrested. So, not a good sign.
We demand that UMass seize the opportunity to be leaders in the U.S. Academy and to take a stance in the face of injustice.
And finally, we demand that UMass engage with us, the community whom UMass represents. And we want everyone to know that silencing us will never work.
We offer those thoughts as a way of resisting the persistent colonizing discourse about the other. We believe ethnographies of immigration can offer readers a glimpse into other lives that bridge common human experience of wanting to improve our lives, to belong to larger groups and large causes, to live meaningful lives. We share our encounters with many forms and identities of immigration, both inclusionary and exclusionary, with the explicit intent to resist and trouble the persistent single story about the outsider. The single story has been told. Yes? The single story has been told, particularly in formal education and government, from the arrogant pedestal of self-proclaimed expertise. It's a view from everywhere, or from objective, as the single story experts claim. In our view, as accidental immigrants, this theoretical and take for granted expertise of the other, of the immigrant, is toxic and exclusionary, regardless of the expert ethical protestations to the contrary. In the spirit of resistance against ideologies of domination, we stand on the shoulders of inclusionary performance to try and create representational mirrors of our own encounter with diaspora. Always situated, subjective, and partial. Just as encounters with the others always are. We are not erasing the history of forced migration. We are not erasing the history of forced migration, slavery, refugees, to name a few. Nor are we sugarcoating the bloodbath of colonial rape in bodies of color. Nor trying to clean the sanguine fluid in the hands of white European men. not turning a blind eye to the imperialist project of corporations, the new colonial force of our times, disguised as corporation promoting free trade, while pushing indigenous peoples out of their homelands, invariably run by the modern conquistadores. Diaspora always includes some kind of loss. Home, land, lives, identities. Instead, we gain dark red memories of blood and bodies. But we are dangerous to power. Like Gloria Zaldúa, we ask to be met halfway. There, we may have a dialogue. In the halfway place, we must find ways to realize we are all migrant locals on this planet.
Where the Trump administration is getting their information to draw their immigration policies right now. They do very different research. At MPI, we do research that based on evidence and based on facts. So that, as you may well know, is something that the Trump administration does not receive very well. So please do not try to not mix these two think tanks from Washington up, because they're very, very different. And I want to talk to you about, I apologize also if my presentation is a little bit disorganized. I was just invited to come here, but some of the research that I do with MPI is related to Central American migration. So I want to talk to you a little bit about children, unaccompanied children migrating to the United States. Why are they coming to the United States, and what is the impact of the recent changes in immigration policy on these children? So starting with what's happening. As maybe many of you know, in the summer of 2014, there was a very sharp increase of the number of unaccompanied children migrating from the Northern Triangle of Central America, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, through Mexico and arriving to the United States and giving themselves in to the Border Patrol. The surge has many reasons, so there's many push and pull factors that are causing this, but mainly it is increased violence targeting young children. So it's violence in Central America has a very long history from the times of the civil wars that happened over there in the 80s, and from the 60s till the 80s and the early 90s. But part of that legacy was that there's a lot of gang violence in these countries. And these gangs have been targeting children, younger and younger children, recently. So in a violent situation like that, when parents see that their children are being targeted by gang members and they're being threatened, there's little option but to go. And there are no institutions in their countries that can protect them well, or other places where they can migrate internally. Many of them are faced with the only option, which is to go to places where they feel safer. Right, so their parents have a difficult decision to make, and they send their children without anybody to make the long journey from their countries of origin through Mexico to arrive to the United States. So we are talking about a refugee situation where there's generalized violence towards a very specific group of people, and this group of people are fleeing that violence because they cannot find the institutions that would protect them inside of their home countries. So that's the context that we're dealing with. And why were they giving themselves into the Border Patrol when they got to the border between the US and Mexico? They were doing that because there's something called the TVPRA. It's a piece of legislation that's trying to attack human trafficking, And that says that if you're an unaccompanied child from a non-contiguous country, that means if you're a person who's under 18 years old, who is not from Mexico or Canada, and you get apprehended by the Border Patrol, they can't deport you immediately. So for Mexican children, when they get deported, when they get apprehended by the Border Patrol, they can be immediately sent back to Mexico. That's not the case for Central American children. Instead, what needs to happen is that they can be held in detention for at most 72 hours, but after that, they need to be sent to the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, which is under HHS, which is under Health and Human, I forget what the S stands for, Services, where these children are then either sheltered by HHS or they find a family member that's already in the United States and they release the unaccompanied child to a family member that's already in the US. So basically, when the unaccompanied children were giving themselves into the Border Patrol, they knew that at the end, the Border Patrol and the Department of Homeland Security was going to transfer them to HHS, and then HHS would then find them a home with one of their family members that already lived in the United States. Now, over 50% of these children had somebody in the United States already. So that's another factor that's attracting these children to the US. So there's no legal, there were already some parents and some uncles and aunts and so on who were already in the US, and these children are facing violence. They want to reunite with their family in the US. There's no legal channels to do so, so then they come without documents and they do that. Anyway, so the responses, there was a whole media attention in 2014 because of this increase in children. And let's not forget the role of the Obama administration in all of this. Because the response from the Obama administration was to increase enforcement, it was to increase detention capacity at detention centers at the border so that they could detain more of these children. And it was to so the immigration courts, well then, under the TVPRA, every single one of these child is entitled to appear with an immigration judge. And the immigration courts in the US have a huge backlog. So the Obama administration, what they did was that they put cases that involve children at the top of the priority for them to appear with a judge and for their cases to be processed as quickly as possible and then being sent back to their countries of origin. So that was one of the responses. However, another more humane response was that the Obama administration created this program called the Central American Minors Program, where they could process asylum applications in the countries of origin. So the idea was that children who were in unsafe situations would go to the US Embassy in their countries of origin, submit an application for asylum, and that they would avoid doing the long trip through Mexico, which is dangerous and problematic too, and their cases would be analyzed in their home countries, and then the US would find out whether they had a valid claim for refugee status in the US. An executive order that is now temporarily stopped by the judges says that there's a 120-day stop on admitting any kinds of refugees from anywhere. That is not just from the 7 countries that had a 90-day travel ban. These were refugees from everywhere. So if Trump's executive order ends up happening again, they would stop even these weak, badly created Central American Minors Program that only brought 6 refugee children from Central America. Even those 6 children would be banned from coming to the US. So the crappy policies under the Obama administration are just becoming harsher. under the Trump administration. So I have two messages today, well, several messages, but one of them is that we should not forget that a lot of the immigration problems, the enforcement problems, the raids, the attacks that immigrants are facing right now were established by the Obama administration. So that's the first thing. But they're becoming worse with the Trump administration. There's another thing that maybe you've been hearing in the news, that there's new raids attacking immigrants. We are looking into that, and what we found is that actually, which proves the point, under the Obama administration, there was an average of about 720 immigrants detained from the interior. So from these raids that happen in the interior of the US. So these are not people who are just crossing the border and are detained at the border, but people who are living in the US and are detained by the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE. And the average per week was around 711, 720 in the Obama administration. In the last week, so in the past week in the Trump administration, they apprehended about 680 people. So the numbers are not so different, but there is a qualitative difference in the people that they're targeting. So we are seeing that under the Trump administration, ICE is going to places that were kind of sacred before, where ICE would not go to before. Things like churches. ICE would remain away from churches because they know that a large portion of the immigrant communities will gather in these churches, and therefore they just had some kind of agreement, different enforcement priorities, and ICE would just not go there. But it seems like that's changing, and they detained a few people right across from a church yesterday. They detained some people who just got out of a hearing because of some unrelated crime that happened to them. So these were immigrants that were victims of crime. They had gone to court to testify, and that was also something that ICE had agreed not to do. So if an immigrant was a victim of a crime, the idea is that they're supposed to go to the law enforcement so that this crime is prosecuted and whoever committed the crime is actually brought to justice. So the idea is that undocumented immigrants should not be afraid of that, right? Of going to the police or to court. And again, during this week, several people were apprehended by ICE just getting out of a court session. When before that wasn't the case. That was not something that ICE would have done under the Obama administration. And I think that's it.
How many people here are proud of public education? Some of you? Okay. There's a lot to say about public education. And of course, you may have heard about the new leaders in education, according to this present government. Having been a teacher in the public schools myself, there's something to say about what is happening now, but also not to lose sight from something that Rodrigo was saying about how policies are not necessarily new, and things, while they are more grave in terms of how they are having an impact on education. As a public educator, I can see also that there are many practices of exclusion that have been happening for many years and for generations. So when we talk about education and exclusion, and we talk about today, it's important, of course, to recognize that today we are, especially if we talk about if we talk of this as a public educator, I can say that public education is under attack. But that is nothing necessarily new. As an educator who has been in the classrooms here in Massachusetts as well, as a teacher of bilingual classrooms, when there was bilingual education in Massachusetts, there's no bilingual education anymore. Um, the children who came, who crossed the border, the families who had sacrificed their own safety to be here, they were part of who we had in our classrooms. The children who have gone through a lot of hardship to be here and to be able to have access to a different life were in our classrooms. I work with the families, I work with the teachers, and I work with the children. So in that environment where there was public education that supported, for example, bilingual education, we could say, oh, then children who are in bilingual classrooms are supported because they are validated in their language and they are going to be accessing public education and learning English as well. So, but if we look at the practices of public education at that time, under policies that were apparently more supportive of diversity in the classrooms, we can also see that there were practices of exclusion. So the fact that we have policies that are under a name apparently more accessible, or they present more access for populations who are minority populations, doesn't mean that the practices that go inside those classrooms are necessarily welcoming of such. So we have to look very closely to what is happening. Beyond labels, of course we are living under very difficult times, but when something changes, we have to really pay attention to what is changing and what is different. I was speaking with one of my fellow colleagues who is not now in UMass, but he was here a couple of years ago. And so about the present times. And he and I, we always pay attention to issues of linguistic diversity, Latino populations, etc. And we were talking, and he said, well, I don't understand why people are shocked, or I am actually shocked that people are shocked. But when were you so comfortable? When? What do you think is so different? So if you are paying attention to the people who are being targeted, it's not that it's necessarily too different now. That kind of exclusion has been happening. And as an educator who actually supports public education, supports teachers, I can see also, I have seen that the policies of exclusion have been present there, even when they were under a label that seemed more open or inclusive. I was a speaker talking to a public school district nearby. They were discussing whether they, for example, should keep or not a logo, a Native American logo in their sports team. So a lot of the discussions were very heated between the board and the people in the audience who had very strong agendas about how having a Native American logo for the sports teams is unacceptable, or how that should change. And some other people who actually thought that they should keep it. As an educator, I came with a lot of questions, but also thinking, well, what happens if it changes? What happens if we get rid of the Native American logo for the sports team? Does it mean that we are more exclusive in our practices, or more inclusive in our practices? And so, as an educator, I came with those questions about what we really need to do is look at what we are doing. Not to say mea culpa, but to go beyond the labels and go beyond the names. And of course, it's a good step. And actually, the school district decided recently that they will eliminate the Native American logo, that, well, we need to do more. We need to do something that represents our commitment to this change. This is not just a label change. And so looking at education and exclusion, I look at things that way. And I hope, and I see that people, my colleagues are really committed to this as well. And so our work is harder now, yes, but it's still our work to look into systems that have been systems of exclusion, In our classrooms, we have, as a teacher, I can speak, but also as a teacher educator, we have the universes that you've been talking about. We have the exclusion of knowledges and the validation of one knowledge as the only knowledge that counts. We have the exclusion of languages and the validation of one language as the language that counts. We have also racial exclusion. So there are things that the universe that we have in our classrooms is so complex. And so it is our work to deal with those, but to also pay attention to those labels and make sure that they just not remain as labels, that we actually do something in practice. We enact inclusion. We just don't talk about it like something that is happening. We enact it. So speaking about enacting, I'm going to enact my short presentation now, and I leave you with that, and peace to everyone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Edwin Morenzi. I'm in the Vet and Animal Science Department. I'm from Rwanda. I've lived in this country for 9 years on an F1 visa. Third year PhD. I was born in '87, and the genocide in Rwanda happened in, well, the actual climax of the genocide happened in 1994. I was born as a refugee in Uganda and lived there for 7 years. What's happening in our political climate right now is very troubling, as I'm sure everybody here agrees. But being a refugee and being outside of your country is something that's very challenging, especially being a child, because your parents have the duty to explain to you that you are not necessarily from Uganda, you are Rwandan. They remind you very explicitly that you're Rwandan, but you have to try everything in your power to fit into the Ugandan society. I'm sure there's a lot of refugees that are going through that fear right now. And for me, one of the biggest things was the lack of ever knowing where you fit in. We could never go back to Rwanda because the violence there was too high, and we were always Rwandan in Uganda. One of the stories I tell people is my parents protected us a lot. They sheltered us from a lot of things. They had found a way. They left Rwanda in the 50s when the ethnic cleansing started, and they found a way to get documents that claimed that they were Ugandan so that they didn't get discriminated against and could get access to jobs and living. So we, for all intents and purposes, acted and lived as we were Ugandan in Uganda. And then 1994 came around, and a lot of what was going on in Rwanda, Uganda and Rwanda border each other. They share a lake, Lake Victoria, and River Akagera that's in Rwanda actually feeds into Lake Victoria. So me and my siblings are in school, we're hanging out, and they call roll call for the morning. This is around May 1994, and we get in line, and the headmaster, the principal of the school, starts talking to everybody and tells us, all of us, he tells us to go home and make sure we tell our parents that we have to be very careful with eating the fish out of Lake Victoria. And the reason why was because there was a lot of bodies floating into Lake Victoria from Rwanda. And here we are as Rwandan citizens, knowing we're Rwandan, and hearing that our countrymen are actually, we can't eat the fish in Uganda because our countrymen's bodies are floating into the lake. And I was born in '87, so I was 7 years old at that time. But again, I was very fortunate because my parents worked for a lot of NGOs, and my dad, at the end of the genocide, my dad got named an ambassador. So we moved as Rwandans at that point. We finally got our passports because the genocide ended in July. And we moved from Rwanda and we moved to Japan. And here are kids basically uprooted from Africa, moved to Asia in the 90s. And I don't know if anyone's ever been to Japan, but being to Japan in the 90s, they basically weren't welcoming to anyone, let alone black people. So we had to deal with that, and luckily I'm from a family of 7 kids, so my closest friends, my best friends are my siblings. Also because my dad's job moved us around every 4 or 5 years. And then fast forward, I got into college in the United States as an immigrant. I got accepted into Newport, Rhode Island, and I've been here since then. I love this country. I've been in this country longer than I've been in any other country in my life. I was born in Uganda, I lived there for 7 years, and I moved around the world. I've lived in the United States for 9 years. For all intents and purposes, I am as American as they come. But because, I mean, you probably can't even tell I have an accent. Most people who hear me, speak to me, when I tell them I've been on a visa for 9 years and I'm actually not a citizen, they're really shocked. But because of the very difficult rules in this country with articulation and citizenship, the 9 years I have spent here, because of my F1 visa, don't count to anything. So even if I try to apply for citizenship, my F1 visa dictates that I'm a full-time immigrant student, and that means that although I've been paying taxes, I own a car in this country. I mean, I own property here, I don't own property in Rwanda. The only thing that's Rwandan about me, except my genetics, is my passport. But I still won't be able to apply for citizenship. And now, seeing that this new administration has come through, it's very troubling and very concerning because I have never felt as unwelcome in this country as I do now. I traveled to London to visit my sister for Christmas, and I made sure I booked my ticket before January 20th because I knew for a fact that there was going to be certain things that were going to happen that might make it really difficult for me to get back into the country because of number 45. So it's very important. It's very important to feel secure, especially by the institution that I give my intellectual property, the institution that I've dedicated 6 years to, that I've published in. It's very important that I feel safe and people like me feel safe, because if I don't feel safe in UMass, then I have nowhere else to turn. So speaking to the sanctuary idea, I check a lot of boxes. Refugee, African, Black. I'm a scientist. I'm also a person who speaks multiple languages. I've lived in this country for 9 years, like I said. I think it's important that people remember that even if there's people here who don't necessarily fit the description of an American, there's people who want to be here, who choose to be here, in spite of all the limitations put ahead of us. And if UMass can understand that, that'd be really important, because my I-20 is given to me by my university, not by my country, but not by the United States. The I-20 is given by the university, and that's really more important than my visa. And that's basically the document that I have to always have on me. Even if I travel within the country, I can travel with a driver's license within the country, but I always have my I-20, because my visa can expire, but as long as my I-20 is there, it's the most important document, and that's given by UMass. It's not given by the government. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's basically where I'm coming from. There's a lot of sad faces I see here, and I mean, take it from a person who's gone through what I've gone through. We have a lot to be thankful for, and people always talk about the time that we live in here is really difficult and really, really hard, and that's true. And this whole "Make America Great Again" thing is one of the biggest oxymorons, because I don't think America has ever been as great as it is now. As a black man, as an immigrant, even with all the things that are happening around, I'll tell you this much: if I had a time machine, I'd never go back in time. I'd always go forward. But you know, so I'm here. I'm gonna be here. I'm not going anywhere. Hopefully, I get my green card somehow. You know, and I'm about to defend and graduate, and I was actually talking to my sister in London, and this is going to be the last thing I talk about, but when I moved to London, I don't know how many of you know, but you know, Donald Trump is only a second step in something that's been happening globally, and Brexit was one of the biggest things that happened, and mockingly, I was laughing at a lot of my family in London. I was like, how could you have guys voted to leave? to leave the EU. And then obviously, I get to the UK and Donald Trump is getting elected. And you know, I was a little apprehensive going to the UK because I felt Brexit was a vote against immigrants. And when I got there, I felt very welcome, very comfortable, and for the first time ever, I considered applying for jobs outside of the United States. And it's something that I'm seriously considering. Because if you work in the UK, regardless of your documentation, if you work in the UK more than 4 years, you're automatically, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but you get permanent residence. If you spend, especially if you're intellectual property, if you are a PhD holder who has been in the country for longer than a year, automatically you can apply for permanent residency. That's not the case here. And also, I was leaving the country, I was leaving the United Kingdom, and I was getting checked out at security, and the gentleman asked me, where are you going? I was like, oh, I'm going to the States, I'm going back to school. He's like, how did you like our country? I was like, it was great, I loved it. I mean, the cops don't have guns here. I actually got lost in London because there was a strike on the tube, the subway, and I had no idea how to get to my sister's place. And I approached a cop. I would never do that here. I'd never do that here. I've been followed in the Great Pioneer Valley. I've been followed by a cop. I've been yelled at by people because I have a Black Lives Matter sticker on my car. So yeah, my relationship to authority in this country is definitely nowhere near that. But I approached this cop and I was like, listen, there's a strike. I have no idea how to get to my sister's place. And because there was a strike, everybody was driving. And I don't know if anyone's been to London. It's horrible to drive in. And the cop literally told me, get in the car, in the front of the car. And he drove me to my sister's place. And we had a conversation and talked. And the whole time, I was just explaining how it was ridiculous that I was in his car getting a ride to my house. And he was like, yeah, where you're coming from is pretty crazy. I'm like, I know. And I got out of his car and he literally goes, good luck. I was like, thank you. So I'm checking out at the airport. And, you know, he's asking me where I'm going. And I tell him, and he was like, how do you like our country? I was like, I loved it. I'm actually considering working here in the future. And he was like, good luck to where you're going. And this is a person who is in a country that voted, you know, pretty against immigration in terms of Brexit. But yeah, it's another thing is being an African. There's always a feeling of being on the outside looking in. At least in the past 9 years for me, the African American experience was always something foreign to me in the sense that it wasn't really my fight. I never felt that it was my fight. I was African, you know. I wasn't getting typecast. Every time someone asked me, you know, like on the surveys, when they say black, other, I always went other, and I wrote African, you know. But now, in the last couple of years, my experience is completely the experience of the African American, especially being followed by cops, being yelled at by people. I see now truly that the plight of African Americans is the plight for everybody else, and I can't just, you know, turn a blind eye and ignore it just because I have a passport that belongs to another country. I pay taxes here. I want to be here. I choose to be here in spite of everything, and I'm going to stay here. So, thank you.
Now, today I come to speak to you not only as a professor and somebody who studies social movements, resistance, and power, but also as somebody who is a Latina, an immigrant to this country, somebody who is affected deeply by the policies of this administration, as a mother of a child with disabilities, and whose extended family members are undocumented in this country. I'm from Colombia, South America. Now, I wanted to begin by stepping a little bit back and talk about power and authority in this country. The state has and always been an instrument of coercion. Make no mistake about that. And we always continue to live in systems of authority. These systems are complex, and on a daily basis they affect us. But most of us often, until recently, go unaware of the way in which they affect us. We obey on a daily basis. Now, I teach a course titled Power, and we have been studying about something that maybe some of you have studied about, the Milgram experiment. It was run by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University. Now, Stanley Milgram did this experiment because he was motivated by trying to understand and grapple with the horrors of the Holocaust. and the need to understand how millions of people were not only killed, but how millions of others were complicit in the killing of their fellow human beings. The time was the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann was considered to be the architect of the Holocaust as the bureaucrat who had been responsible for the transport of millions of Jews across Europe. Now, in the audience of the trial was Hannah Arendt, one of my personal heroes, the philosopher and German Jewish emigre in this country. And one of Hannah Arendt's arguments was that people like Eichmann were not monstrous, that evil was banal. Her point was not that Eichmann was to be ignored or that we shouldn't take things like that seriously, like people like bureaucrats seriously, but rather that ordinary people can be implicating and doing horrible things every day. I mentioned this because I recently came across an article by the Baltimore Sun that brought up Milgram's experiment and the issue of blind obedience to authority and carrying out immoral actions. In sections, one of our TAs come up with a great question, which was, are there Eichmanns today? Now, the response of the article is that in the aftermath of the Bustling ban, there are. You had TSA officers and airport personnel, ordinary people who were getting up in the morning, put on their outfits, and did their jobs, who emerged trying to were called to carry out Trump's immoral Muslim ban. And in doing so, did inhumane things, such as, to name a few, keep a 5-year-old in detention handcuffed for over 24 hours, keep refugees that had been granted asylum and had trekked a long way to come to for safety from Syria from reaching this country, handcuffing a 60-year-old woman from Qatar who was visiting her son, and holding people without food for 20 hours. I have a 6-month-old baby, and one of the things that grabbed my attention was also the keeping of a nursing baby from its mother for over 20 hours. Now, the power of authority is everywhere, but despite all this, are we powerless against this? For the past month, since the inauguration of Donald Trump, the answer has been hell no. Hell no. Now, in the aftermath of the Trump's executive order instituting this ban, one of the signs that most caught my attention in the protests in the airports was the signs that said, let's make ourselves ungovernable. I love this, because that's our call to arms, is resistance by making ourselves ungovernable. To me, this sign brought back one of my favorite thinkers, the transcendentalist philosopher Henry David Thoreau, who in his essay of Resistance to Civil Government of 1849 argued that civil resistance was key to democratic politics. It was the essence of being a good Democrat. Compliance in things in government is not the same as consent, and we don't explicitly consent. So we have a moral duty to resist things that we are opposed to. If we see unjust laws and unjust actions, it's our duty to disobey. He's called on us to be, and one of my favorite words that has always captured me is he called on us to be a counter-friction. He said, be a counter-friction. Not just a cog in the wheel, but somebody that throws sand in the gears. We need to do that. Now, he said, and evocatively, I declare war against the state in my own fashion. Let me say that. I declare war against the state in my own fashion. So it's morally necessary and just to exercise resistance, to become ungovernable, and to make ourselves so. But how do we do that? Now, I've talked about Thoreau and talked about Milgram, but one of the other things I want to point you in the direction to is the places where I do research is in Latin America, particularly indigenous social movements. And I wanted to mention some of the things that indigenous social movements have done in conditions of authoritarian rule to oppose that, to disobey and make themselves ungovernable. So first, I wanted to mention, and mostly I'll focus in so that we can have some time for other speakers, is the Ecuadorian indigenous movement. The Ecuadorian indigenous movement has been considered to be one of the most powerful on the continent. One of the things that most stood out for me was their groundbreaking Levantamiento del Inti Raymi, which is an uprising of Inti Raymi, it's the summer solstice, which took place in 1990. Indigenous groups in the country had been one of the most vulnerable, marginalized, and targeted populations since the colonial period. And yet, in 1990, they burst forth on the scene in unparalleled numbers to stage inspiring and awe-inspiring movements and organized protest actions that not only showed that that indigenous people could bring the country to its knees, and indeed they did. So my question has been, how did they manage to do that? And I want to share with you how they did, at least in this moment, is a couple of things that they did. Great organization, but also a lot of creativity. Not only did they organize in massive numbers to bring attention to rights claims, including recognition of territorial, language, and cultural claims, along with political participation and representation, but they also used their resources to develop a series of tactics that were very effective. Number one, they did roadblocks. So if we're talking about counter-friction, this is the essence of counter-friction. Roadblocks that created major paralysis in the country's highways and blocked the transports of goods and people into the urban centers. They took over symbolically charged places. In the case for them, churches, to decolonize them. So there's an important symbolic element to takeovers. They also organized what we're doing in this country, marches. But not just marches within one place, but from one city to another, creating greater disruption in the highways, and also showing by their march from one city to another the high levels of sacrifice involved for participants who had to march not just within one city, but great distances to get to urban centers. These were incremental and allowed for growth in routes so that more and more people joined in as they participated. And they organized mobilizations that brought together not just a series of groups, but coalition of groups, not just to protest, but to support affirmative policies. Now, I mentioned this, I also wanted to mention more recent protests in 2013 against the president's actions to open up Yasuni Bioreserve, which is an Ecuadorian Amazon's region. President Correa tried to open it up and has opened it up to extractive industries by oil companies. The protest here included the tactics of marches, but important coalition building between environmental, indigenous, women, and student groups. So the importance of coalition building is crucial. It also did something very creative, is install ethical tribunals which opened its doors on January 2014 to hold trials, to hold the state officials, members of oil companies before the court of public opinion against their damages that they were doing in these pristine territories. So there's an important creativity about these ethical tribunals that I want to emphasize. Now, I mentioned these tactics because it's important to remember that this is the time for creativity. This is the time for doing what Thoreau called us to do, to declare war against the state and be a counter-friction. Now, I know that some people have said, well, things have been the same as they have been, and certainly in many ways there have been many of the deportation policies are just intensified, that actions of exclusion, and I certainly have been the target of some of those, have been, it's sometimes the same as it always will be, but some things are different, and I want to make sure that we don't lull ourselves into complacency about how different things are. The administration has only been in office for less than a month, and we are already seeing those differences. Things are intensified, and they're taking new shapes in ways that we have not seen before. We are seeing the intensification of, for instance, the amount of ICE raids and the individuals targeted. More recently, one of the things that captured my attention was a woman who has been held in detention by ICE simply for testifying against her abuser in a domestic violence case. These things are qualitatively different. So what are we called on to do? We're called on to not only focus on the similarities, but understand that right now we need to see those differences and act and see the pragmatic importance of action. That it's not a time to just sit by and become ordinary individuals living about our everyday lives in compliance to authority, but really that we need to be reflective every day in the ways that the actions that we take every day and we go back and conduct ourselves every day show whether we support or not the things that are going around in our world and that this administration is instating. So with that said, I want to turn over the mic to Caroline Murray, who has been working at the national level with the Immigration Rights Reform Group, who's going to talk to you about a little bit more about some of the ways in which things are qualitatively different in terms of immigration policy in this country.
And we've created a group called Amherst Sanctuary that I want to share a little bit about that work and how it intersects with the work you're doing here on campus. So big picture, right, we know that there was these executive orders that were passed, both impacting refugees and immigrants, and a whole slew of them impacting undocumented people. There was also a whole slew of them that expanded police powers. So the sort of triumvirate of all of those together really do create an authoritarian state. And this is no joke at this point. And when you look at the three of them, and today's Associated Press report that Trump is considering activating the National Guard to conduct sweeps. I don't say this to create panic, but it is important that we are prepared and that we know which side we're on and what steps we are able to take. So all of us will be able to resist in different ways, right? And really this is the time to decide what you can do and what you can't do. And any participation is good. So in Amherst, we are working on a bylaw. So there was a resolution passed previously that declared the intention to make sure the town is a welcoming community. But we're changing that now to a law. And that will control any police interactions with federal immigration, and we're hopefully going to make that law say that they will only interact with federal immigration officials in the event they present a criminal warrant. That's not what it says now. So criminal warrant must be presented. We're also making sure that they have no access to our public schools, so the doors are locked without a criminal warrant. And we're looking at making sure that this policy applies to every single town employee, where there will be no one asking anyone of their status at any point in time. These points are very important because as the executive order sort of expands the definition of what a criminal is, that will impact people if you get pulled over by the police, if you drive through a stop sign, if you do find yourself in police custody. We're saying that they can't ask about your status because it's sort of a new form of don't ask, don't tell. What's very scary is that the executive orders actually expanded the definition of a crime. So a crime is now considered to be a civil traffic violation, such as going through a stop sign. So that's a little bit about what's different and how it now expands to a whole group of people. So what are we doing very specifically? We have a sort of three-pronged approach. So one prong is creating new laws. But we know that those laws are, in and of themselves are not sufficient. Those laws will be coming to town meeting, by the way, and we have a petition that's getting passed around by Jenny Gutierrez. Here she is. Jenny is part of our Amherst Sanctuary Committee. Thank you, Jenny. So please sign the petition. This is what we're going to be presenting to town meeting to show the support for our bylaw. But the other two prongs are just as important. So the first one is we're creating a warning system. So most immigrants that we know use WhatsApp. Do people here use WhatsApp? And it's encrypted. So we're going to set up a very controlled text loop of people who are immediately impacted and who are sort of grounded and in communication with folks. That will be a warning system if there is an incursion by ICE or CBP into our communities. So we'll have a warning system established, and we invite people who are sort of skilled at those kinds of things to join this committee. When the warning system is activated, there will be mobilizing of allies in the community, and we are working with the Pioneer Valley Worker Center and the Sanctuary in the Streets group to be able to activate folks to go to those locations where the incursion is taking place. There will be some people who are willing to put their bodies in between the ICE officials and anyone's home. That is important to recognize that that is not simply civil disobedience, that could be a charge of interfering with police or federal law. So again, as you're considering what you're able to do, that would be an increased level of risk. As people are blocking access from the homes by federal immigration enforcement, we also have folks who will be providing safe harbor, both in their homes and in a network of churches. We already have 2 churches in town that have agreed to serve as sanctuary spaces. We're also, though, creating a very small network of people with homes who are willing to open them up. And again, that is an added level of risk that requires, they'll be very, very, very vetted. It'll be a very small community of people. So those sort of actions combined will hopefully enable us to get through the next 4 years with the least amount of damage to our friends, neighbors, families, and community as possible. And I encourage you all to sign the petition. And we're having a meeting on March 4th where we'll actually be breaking out into these action subcommittees and planning the next steps. So if you want to join, please do come on March 4th. It's at Grace Episcopal Church in Amherst, and we'll be following up with your committee here. And we're so glad to be working with all of you. We recognize that the Amherst bylaw doesn't impact UMass, so it's really important that we make sure that our sanctuary bylaws work together, because we don't want, if an Amherst resident steps on the campus to get arrested, or if one of the campus residents steps in town to get arrested. So it's important that we link our efforts. Thanks so much.